Many people worry that their dog is growling, barking, lunging at people to protect them. It's one of the most common explanations that guardians give me for their barky, growly dog. My dog's protecting me. But is that really true? How can we know for sure? So if you're worried that your dog is protecting you, this video is definitely for you. Hi, I'm Emma. Today I'm going to take you through a fragrant romp through everything to do with protective behaviour in dogs. It's a common theme with many of my clients who are often astonished to find that there are other things at work. It's not uncommon to hear a story like this one where a client had come back from a walk, they'd stopped to chat with a neighbour, and when the neighbour came forwards to say hello, the dog lunged and snapped at the neighbour. So many of us ask the question as to whether our dog is protecting us. It's not just about dogs growling, barking, snapping, snarling, lunging, or even biting people they see out on walk. It's not uncommon for clients to tell me that their dog is protecting them from a family member, like the case history here. So there are more dogs keeping partners out of beds, off sofas, and interrupting date nights than you can probably imagine. But sometimes that behaviour seems to be directed as well to individuals within the home. So let's talk about the elephant in the room first. Wherever clients misunderstand what's going on, a lot of the time it's to do with the fact, this very human habit of thinking that everything that happens relates to us. Now, I don't want you to feel bad. Neither do I want you to take exception. It's normal. It's a human thing. It's a human habit that we think that everything relates to us. Your dog may well also be protecting you, but there are simpler explanations that we do need to rule out first, because if we're working with a dog and we are expecting that behaviour to be protective behaviour and actually other things are going on, then we won't see any progress because we won't be making the right moves. So working with a truly protective dog is different than working with other scenarios, and we need to know that we're working on the right problem. So let's have a look at a typical scenario. So you're on your walk with your dog and somebody approaches you. Why we need to consider simpler solutions first is because there's a lot of processing that's going on that's actually cognitively complex. Protection is actually a really hard thing to do. So the first is that the animal has to feel threatened. That's easy. That's a pretty low level theory of mind. I feel scared, me. I know how I feel. And that's the most basic level of theory of mind. The next level up is to understand that someone means harm. Understanding that another individual means to hurt you is to take another level of cognitive complexity. So certain behaviours suggest that another individual means harm. They're easy to interpret. So when we think about dogs, things like hard stares, direct approaches, especially running at another animal, those are clear indications that another individual might mean harm, and they're good signals to the dog. But outside of those threatening signals, for a dog to interpret that another human being means a threat to them when they're not showing any signs of being a threat, that's another level of cognitive complexity. So many dogs who we think are protecting us are actually just stuck at this baseline level. They feel scared. And the main reason that they're stuck there is they probably didn't get a lot of exposure to humans during critical development periods, and they don't realise that humans are rubbish and do things like stare at dogs without it actually meaning that they are going to start a war. So dogs are seeing threats when there are none. So both of the dogs in the example are stuck at below this level of thinking that the other individual means to threat. They feel scared, but they've misunderstood things like approaches or kisses as a threat to them. And if your dog is misreading common situations and they think that a stranger or a family member means to harm them, or that another dog means to harm them when no harm was meant, then they're not protective, they're just scared. So not only would a protective dog have to understand that you meant harm, or the other individual meant harm, and to be able to differentiate between situations that aren't threatening and situations that actually are, they then have to understand that another individual beyond themselves feels scared or knows that they're unaware of the danger. So although this is cognitive thought process beyond many animals, dogs can pick up on the emotions of a social group. So protecting another individual who feels afraid is not beyond them, their capacity completely. Plus we know things like they can hear our heartbeats, they can feel our pulses, they know that we feel anxious. So it can be that because we're connected to the dog, they're reading the signs in us that we feel scared. scared, rather than the fact that, you know, that there's something magical going on that they really understand. Where it gets really complex is where that where we as the guardian aren't actually aware of the threat. And just bear in mind as well that it need not necessarily be a human. That's very human centric of me again, that the dog is guarding. So Heston, my boy, I'm going to give you a story later where he was protecting his girlfriend, who he'd been playing with all day, and there were very clear signs that this was protective behaviour. It was very distinct. He's not afraid of other dogs. He certainly didn't have a bad relationship with the dogs in the house, but he guarded her while she was asleep. And while he would kind of sit back and take a rest, she didn't know that she was, you know, that other dogs were going to come and approach her while she was sleeping. So that was a really cognitive, complex thought process there that was going on, and he wasn't actually reading that she felt afraid of the other dogs. He was actually making a decision that she should feel afraid because those other dogs meant to play with her and how terrible that would be. So they also have to know that the threat is a real threat and it's not intended to hurt them. So I'm going to be honest and say there's a whole lot of humans with our enormous big brains that can't distinguish between a threat to somebody else and a threat to ourselves, and we take everything personally. So you can see what a hugely cognitive, complex process this is. And then finally, the cherry on the cake, the dog also has to know that they can do something about it. My buddy is in danger, I can do something about it, I'm going to stop that mugger in their tracks. So typically then, protective dogs realise that the threat is not to them, it's to someone else, and that may be another dog, it could be a cat, it could be a human being. They also have to be able to discriminate between individuals who are harmful and those who are not. So one great example of a dog posted on the Lighten Up Facebook page was a great dog, really great with people, had had hundreds of safe interactions with passers-by, although what happened changed things a little bit, I believe. But when their guardian was about to be attacked, the dog stepped in and saw off the attacker. So that's your very typical protective dog, that they are very able to distinguish between who is a threat and who means to be a threat and who isn't. And they also understand that the threat isn't to them, it's actually to their guardian or to somebody within their family. So we've got a lot of rule outs to do, where we've got to rule out other explanations that are more simple first. So deciding whether your dog is protective or not is actually a process of elimination and just these rule outs. We've got to rule out more simple explanations first to ensure that our own very human thinking isn't influencing our understanding. And the first rule out is that the dog simply feels scared. They are scared of strangers who approach them. They're uncomfortable around people's strange human actions. They don't like guests. They don't like hands coming in towards them. They may be able to tolerate slightly less threatening individuals, but they just don't feel safe around people. Things like being reached over, being stepped over, being reached towards, these are all things that dogs feel uncomfortable with, especially when those things are from strangers. I would say that the vast majority of people who tell me that their dog is protecting them or they're worried that the dog is protecting them, their dog actually just feels safe, unsafe, and it's just every man for himself or every dog for himself. The next rule out that we've got to do though, and this is probably the next category that I find a lot of these dogs fit into, is whether the dogs were just anxious that they were going to lose a valued resource or that they were going to lose an activity that would be curtailed. So Heston wasn't protecting, she was called Galaxy, he wasn't protecting Galaxy from the other dogs when they were all awake. It was just simply when Galaxy was resting and she, you know, something happened within that dynamic, and he certainly wasn't afraid of the other dogs or scared of the other dogs, and he didn't think that a resource, the playing together, was going to be taken away from him, but he could have, you know, been guarding this friendship in that kind of way, who knows. So but we've got to kind of bear that in mind, that where there are resources involved, that a dog can sometimes just be anxious of losing those resources, and also they could be anxious about losing access to an activity or preferential access to an activity. But I've got a little bit of a newsflash. So newsflash number one of this one: you are not a resource. You are a living, breathing human being. So don't devalue yourself into simply being a resource and say that your dog is resource guarding guarding you, because resource guarding relates to food items, toys, bowls, water, preferential resting spaces, and space also not really a resource. You know, we don't use space in that kind of a way. And I sometimes hear people saying that their dog's guarding their space or they're guarding themselves, and those are not good explanations for what's happening in those situations. I'm going to cover them in another video, but usually what's going on in those situations, the dog's pretty sensitive to being handled, and there are lots of reasons behind that. It's not unusual though for dogs who don't like being handled to also be resource guardy, and if you've read Jean Donaldson's wonderful book Mine, she makes that link there. And virtually every single dog that I see who's got resource guarding problems is also, you're not grabbing me, and has had a little bit of problems with handling sensitivity. So I'm working with a dog at the moment who can't be groomed, and he's got resource guarding issues in various different ways, and the complexity of that is quite clear. But what he's not doing is protecting a particular guardian, and he's also not guarding his space, because that's not, you know, the space is everywhere. It would be impossible to guard it. It would be a really weird kind of way to explain a dog's behaviour to say that. Dogs can also, though, struggle with irritation if they suspect that something they are enjoying is about to come to an end. So this is my little girl Tilly, and she died a few years back, but her dying act was to snap at my other girl Flicker. So Tilly was about to go to her vet, you know, for the final visit, and it was all really sad, and I was sitting on the sofa comforting her around our final moments together. Flicker, totally not understanding what's going on as per normal, sees that kind of petting is on the table, Emma has another hand, and she came over to make use of that other hand for a bit of petting for herself, and Tilly snapped at her. So this is a prime example of a dog who didn't want her own petting to stop, and she didn't want another dog approaching her when she was resting, and probably she felt pretty terrible as well because she was dying. So Tilly was also the queen of resource guarding, you know, mouldy bread rolls, crab apples, hamburger shaped toys. She didn't like to be approached or touched when she was rested, and handling was also a bit of an issue with her as well when she arrived. So these are perfectly normal dog behaviours. They're not protective behaviours. So her proximity to me was accidental. I could have thought when she was sitting on my lap that she was guarding me from Flicker, and actually I was pretty incidental. She was getting some petting that was coming from me, but she wasn't guarding me, and neither was she guarding, you know, she wasn't resource guarding me, she wasn't resource guarding the space. She was just enjoying an activity that Flicker was about to bring to an end by coming over. So that's perfectly normal behaviour. So the other thing that it also reminds me of a very good point, that the activities or items don't have to be valuable or under threat. It just has to be that the dog thinks that they are. So Tilly thought that everybody was after her mouldy bread roll, you know that she did, and you know, of course nobody wanted that mouldy bread roll, but sometimes items can become valuable to a dog just because we want to get them back off the dog. So Tilly had to go through all of these things with her about resource guarding, of food bowls, of toys, of water bowls, of bed space and resting spots and so on. And that kind of behaviour, I was incidental. So I can sometimes see that if she only ever did it when I was sitting there, I might think that it related to me. But sometimes we give them a bit more confidence that they wouldn't have had if we weren't there. And the other times that Tilly would actually come and sit on me or sit very close to me was when I had guests. And again, it wasn't that she was guarding me from the guests, she didn't feel comfortable and I was her source of comfort. So it's kind of, you know, child hiding behind mother's apron strings kind of situation, and more to do with her underlying anxiety than the fact that she was protective of me. This one says rule out number 4, and it's really rule out number 3. So we also need to rule out territory. So in the first example, the guardian was actually on the threshold of a garden, just going in through the gate. And territorial behaviour is relatively easy to identify and rule out. So it's really important to consider that first. Basically, does the dog do it at any other place other than on home ground? So you can, of course, hit the link that's in the comment section if you want to watch that video about territorial behaviour that I recorded last week. It's a much simpler explanation for behaviour that we have to consider. It's much easier for dogs to do, and it's an easy one to rule out. So that's kind of more instinct, whereas protective behaviour is not necessarily something that all dogs will do because of that cognitive complexity. So the true rule out number 4. So we've ruled out a general fear of strangers, we've ruled out resource guarding, we've ruled out anxiety about the curtailment or potential curtailment of an activity, we've ruled out territorial behaviour. We should also rule out a poor relationship and a lack of trust if the dog keeps attacking a single individual, especially if that's a family member. So quite often what I find there is there's a long and poor history between the individual and the dog in the home. And the dog may be struggling with their attachment, so they might have an insecure attachment style to both guardians. They might be hyper attached to one guardian, struggling to attach to the other, and again the dog doesn't feel safe in themselves and the behaviour isn't generalised to others. So what generally happens in those situations is when the dog begins to trust the situation and they feel safe in the home and they feel relaxed around the guardians, we often see these behaviours kind of fade out, if you like. So now we've ruled out all of these, it's a lot easier to decide if we do have a protective dog. So remember, a protective dog should understand that there is no threat and when there is. So this very short clip is taken from French ring sports, where there's a simulation called Défense du Maître. And in this, the dog should not be barking, they shouldn't be lunging, they shouldn't be snapping at any of the other strangers present, they should be fine recognising normal human behaviour like handshakes and the fact that humans do walk head on towards each other. But it's also just important to remind you that this is a simulation with trained individuals and a dog who realises that this is a game. Okay, so if you're watching this little clip here, so we see the guy walk up, we see the dog maybe get an instruction and they're walking and they're happy and the dog is relaxed, perhaps he realises that something's going to go on, he'd seen a man in a bike suit before, and you can see all of the other men walking around the monitors who are evaluating what's going on, but the dog is relaxed and doesn't see any of those people as a threat, which we would expect if the dog just doesn't feel safe in general with people. So what's going to happen then when the stranger moves in? See how the dog was blocking him? We're going to watch this again, but he's blocking access to his human. The behaviour is calm, there's no barking, there's no lunging, there's no growling, but the dog is ready for the task. And when the stranger reaches in there, the dog grabs him. And I know this is clearly trained dogs in protection sports, it's very much a simulation, but these are just, we have to remember, these are just codified behaviours under stimulus control that are very natural for a dog to do. There's really nothing happening in protection sports that the dog can't already do. They've got the instinctive knowledge of how to perform these behaviours and they feel perfectly natural to the dog to do it, even though they've had no training. And I have had other dog trainers send me dogs who they thought have been trained for protection sports, weren't really. You can tell very easily that a dog has been trained for protection sports because you just wear the kit, and as soon as you bring the kit out, if they enjoy the sport, then they're going to feel excited by it and you're going to get an excited reaction, and if they don't feel excited by it, then you're going to get the other and you're going to get them kind of growling. So I do work with a lot of dogs who've come from the protection sports industry and who've also come from the security industry, where these behaviours don't kind of function in the same way. But what I do see is kind of they understand what's going on and they understand that it's a game, but these behaviours are perfectly natural to do. Nobody taught Liddy how to do this and it's exactly what she does. So don't be surprised if we're walking down the road and Malinois comes flying out after you and grabs your arm, because Malinois do that from time to time. Usually, again, it comes back to a lack of socialisation and they've not been taught the rules. And that's one of the reasons I get so many dogs from the protection sports industry, because it's about putting it under stimulus control. And as David Ryan once said, he's worked with the dogs in Greater Manchester, I believe, or Lancashire, had said, when asked, German Shepherds or Malinois, he said, well, you have to teach a Malinois not to bite and you have to teach a German Shepherd to bite. And I think that's very true, that a lot of Malinois have been ruined because it's very instinctive behaviour for them, just as it is for lots of other dogs like terriers though. So there's nothing new there, there's nothing different about Malinois than any other dog. So the first step then in identifying protective behaviour is simply ruling out those easier explanations first. We need to rule out A, generalised fearfulness of strangers. We need to rule out resource guarding, whether the behaviour happens in the home or whether it's out on a walk. So for instance, a dog with a ball approached by a dog that they don't know in a park could well be afraid of other dogs approaching them, or they could be afraid of the fact that their ball is going to get stolen. So we need to also rule out that our dog's fear is about a preferential access to an activity like petting or resting in a comfy spot that's about to be cut short. And then we need to rule out the effects of territory. So finally, if the behaviour is aimed at a specific individual in the home, we also need to rule out a lack of trust. So there's a big difference between a dog who intervenes in a violent confrontation between spouses and a dog who bites a husband because he brings you a cup of tea in bed. And, you know, I have had cases with people who've got, particularly when the early stages of dementia, if there's violence there, and where spouses have started lashing out against the other spouse, that a dog has sometimes bitten the one who's causing the problem, and that kind of situation is not unfamiliar to me. So we do have those situations, but my favourite kind of, is this protective behaviour or not, is always going to be about Dalek the Rottweiler, who was at Mornack, the shelter, for a long time, and Steve and Steve's lunch. So Steve worked with Dalek a long time, and one day Steve was sitting down, as he tends to do, having his snack, and Dalek was sitting with him, and our president walked across to him, and Dalek went absolutely nuts, but he went absolutely nuts every time he saw the president. Just didn't like her. There was something about the way she moved, maybe, I don't know. So, you know, could I have got in there and stolen Steve's sandwich? I do not know. But that's my kind of rule out where we're talking about protective behaviour, is did the dog recognise that the person was actually under threat, the person who they consider to be part of their family, and was that threat genuine threat? So we would expect to see a protective dog would only do that in circumstances where something really bad was going to happen. That may be stealing a sandwich, or something that, you know, of value to the person and the dog. But we've got to do those rule outs first, and that simple rule out, the dog should do that to anybody who threatened Steve in that circumstance where he's taking his sandwich. It shouldn't just be that individual. But you do find as well layers of things. So if you don't like the person, and you're a bit territorial, and you're a bit guardy, and you're protective, you may see that more with certain individuals and less with others. So, you know, if you don't feel that bad about another individual and you trust other people, then you're less likely to be protective because you understand more the motivations. So we've got a lot of things that we've got to rule out, where we've got to understand much simpler explanations first. And we need to make sure that we've done that before we then go on to decide that our dog is protecting us. And another thing that we really have to consider is the role of impulsivity and impulse control. So where dogs are choosing big behaviours for small events, it can simply be a problem with impulse control. So notice how the dog in the video used just enough force to stop the man, and that's how much force we should expect to see in a protective dog. We shouldn't expect to see over the top behaviours that are out of context, you know. So we should be expecting that it will be a quick response. There will be no deliberation. It won't be evaluating consequences, and it will be a big explosive behaviour, which is the problem I have with Liddy. And then what we're left with through that process of elimination is a very clear pattern of what protective behaviour actually does look like when they're protecting another individual and not themselves. So if they're protecting themselves, then you're more than likely looking at issues to do with trust, handling, proximity of threat, escape behaviours, resource guarding, those kind of things. Okay, so we wouldn't expect them to be doing any of these things, and when we are going through and looking at the things that protective dogs do, I should have ruled out all of those things first. So protective behaviour, they're protecting another individual, not themselves. They're also not anxious, fearful or hypervigilant on the whole. We wouldn't expect to see a high degree of anxiety in protective behaviour. So where there's protective behaviour and a high degree of anxiety, that's usually when you sort the anxiety out, the protective behaviour magically kind of disappears. Well, not magically, scientifically. So if you've got an anxious dog who's behaving in this way, always work on the anxiety first. A protective dog will also use their body to block approaches. That's what Heston was doing. He was sitting between the rest of the dogs and Galaxy, and if the dogs moved, he moved. So they get in the way. They'll run interference, and we forget that sometimes some dogs are very conscious of using their body to calm situations, to slow other dogs down, to intervene, to block, to corral, to even split up dogs that are potentially overexcited or struggling a little bit. And so they will use their body in that kind of way to block approaches and to escalate aggression if necessary, and to de-escalate if they can. So the major distinction between many of these is that a protected dog will be largely approachable without the individual that they were protecting. So this is, just reminded me again of that situation with Heston. They played loads, and when she settled down to sleep, he stood in guard and he wouldn't let the other dogs go near her. They were fine to play with her when she wasn't resting, and he had no problem with them approaching her then. But when she was off guard, his kind of stalker protective tendencies took over. So as you can see, it can be really isolated anecdotes, really. That's how rare protective behaviour can actually be. Another thing that we'd expect to see is the dog leaves what they're doing and moves in towards the individual that they're protecting. So say, for instance, the dog was digging a hole in the garden and somebody came in and threatened the guardian, then the dog would move into wherever the guardian was. And it's not seeking reassurance or support like Tilly was when she sat on my knee when guests came. It's offering reassurance and support. There's a big difference. So for Heston example, he did go to sleep eventually with his stalker guardian tendencies, but if any dog moved, he was back to his vigil and he was back to checking out where they were going, and he moved back to Galaxy to ensure that she was safe while she slept. And finally, they may be dogs from working lines of working breeds that are used to protect. So let's just be clear, all dogs can be protective. They've all got the genetic coding, that ancient memory that has got the potential to awaken them in them all. But through selective breeding, we're more likely to more frequently find this in certain types of or breeds of dog, but we shouldn't rule it out with other breeds either. So I talked last time about livestock guardian breeds, the Grand Pyrenees especially, where when they were studied, they were found to be bonded with their flock rather than being territorial. So in other words, when they were seeing off threats when they were working, it's not to do with the fact that there's an incursion onto their range, but because they're bonded to the flock. So from the Pyrenees to the Dolomites, through the dogs of Greece, the Balkans, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, across right over into Pakistan, many dogs have been selected over millennia to protect the flock. So mastiffs like the Spanish Mastiff and their relatives are all dogs from rustic stock, bred to keep livestock safe, and protection comes easily to them. Their close relatives, descendants perhaps, of continental shepherd dogs, they're also be able to work in a protective role. Indeed, one of my former French neighbours had a Patu, the Grand Pyrenees, and a Beauceron who lived with his sheep, so he had both. It may be for all the wolves that are around the area. Or the sheep rustlers. It may be more likely, though, that dogs specifically selected for protective behaviours might tend to show them more frequently, but it certainly doesn't mean that your poodle can't be struggling with the exact same issues. All this, of course, brings us to how we work with that select few protective dogs who are freelancing, causing problems for the guardians. So much is going to be to do with threat cues and safety cues, where the guardian can help the dog distinguish between what's safe and what's not. You might have seen the guy give the cue to the dog that the man was safe as he approached him not to bite him, and then give the dog the cue to go on to guard. So that, though, my lovely viewers, is beyond the scope of this little video and something for another time. So don't forget to give me a thumbs up if you found this video helpful, so I know to make more content like this in future, and hit subscribe if you want regular updates. Speak to you next time.